Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to the special legislative session on studying the implementation of new school start times in Rhode Island. Tonight's agenda is just public comment. We do have 3 people signed up to testify, but I just wanted to talk about some of the written testimony that I have first that all members of the commission should have. We have attendance first, yes.
It's okay. Chairwoman Casimiro.
Here.
Representative Donovan. Lieutenant Governor McKee. Here. Superintendent Agier. Here. Superintendent Mitchell. Here. Superintendent Burns Germain. Donna Policastro. Robert Walsh. Here. Colleen Callahan. Tom Mazzotti. Keith Oliveira.
Yeah.
Andy Andrade. Here. Kelly Aronikis. And Steve DeToy.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you. Okay, so all the members of the commission do have written testimony submitted by Cynthia Rosengard, which is in favor of later high school start times. We also have written testimony from Jennifer Boylan of Barrington, also in favor of later high school start times. We have received written testimony from Debbie Jaff, who is against it, Jason Lee, who is against it, Ann Peltier, who is against it, and Gina Pine, who is neither in favor or against. She just was hoping to get another opportunity to testify during public comment. Those signed up to testify tonight, we're going to call them in order of their sign-in. The first one is Cynthia Rosengard, and she is in favor.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Can we have more than 2 minutes since there's only 3 of us? My name is Cynthia Rosengard. I'm a Barrington High School parent. I have 2 children who are in the high school. I need to say that I'm here as a private citizen of Barrington, Rhode Island, and not representing the school department or any formal body in Barrington, Rhode Island. I'm also a clinical psychologist and a public health practitioner, and I have dedicated my career to studying adolescents and their health behaviors, so I come from this from a variety of different angles. I want to tell you a little bit about our experience in Barrington, although I know you've heard from our superintendent. I think it might be helpful for you to hear from a constituent, a parent there. Believe it or not, we've been talking about school start times for the last 6 years in Barrington. And in many ways, Barrington kind of did it the way you would expect. They started with public forums for parents and students and teachers. They conducted surveys. And then after 4 years, they had a vote to move school start times to later. So as someone who started this process when my son was in 5th grade, I was kind of stunned when there was this huge outcry in Barrington of parents and teachers and students who were vehemently against this change. And I would say that in Barrington, this issue has really kind of torn apart the fabric of the town in many ways, and this might not be surprising to those of you who've been receiving multiple emails from Barrington residents. Yes. Instead of it being kind of a spirited, rational debate about the change and that would have allowed for the generation of solutions to problems that are brought up, it's resulted in students being peer pressured into signing petitions. It's been family friendships severed after many years. It's been people hurling baseless accusations of ethical breaches among members of our elected bodies. It's really been a very negative force, and I think because of that, our leadership at the school department has backed away from it pretty significantly, even though there was a 6-month process of an implementation subcommittee that basically solved all the many problems that had been raised by those in opposition to school start times. So I think my reason for being here is that I think that there does need to be some statewide assistance for jurisdictions that want to do this. and encouragement among all districts in Rhode Island to engage with this process. So while I sort of bristled at the idea of the original legislation including a mandate, I do think there should be some deadline by which people either have made this change or are able to justify in very detailed ways why they can't make the change by that deadline and what their plan is in place for making the change in a reasonable amount of time. The main areas that districts need support in are in transportation challenges, sports scheduling, and childcare issues. Those seem to come up again and again, and I'm sure you guys have been doing the research so you know this. The ideas that I put forth in my written testimony is to potentially provide challenge grants to districts that are kind of poised and ready to do this, but maybe need a transportation subcommittee or an implementation subcommittee in order to get things over the last of the hoops. It would be great if there was a statewide effort for athletic directors and sports directors to meet and discuss the issues around scheduling and practice times and those kinds of issues that come into play. And the last piece that we were having difficulty with is we have some vendors who want to provide in-school both before and after childcare, but they're having difficulty getting through the accreditation process at DCYF. So taking a look at that process and streamlining it for vendors who might want to provide that, I think all of those things would be really useful across the state. Thank you very much for your time and energy. Yeah. So there are two vendors in Barrington who are interested in doing that, the YMCA, and I'm forgetting the name of the other company, but it's a nationwide company. And they want to provide it in the schools so that parents could drop their kids off a little bit earlier. Right. Right. Exactly. But the YMCA already provides after-school care at the YMCA, so kids get picked up after school and brought to the YMCA, but this would also add that additional on-site in the morning. There's one school in our district that doesn't go to school. The kids aren't needing to be in school until 9 o'clock in the morning. That's okay. We're a good test case. I'm not sure I understand your question.
When you were deliberating over the, I'm sorry, when you were deliberating times,
Yes.
one of the issues was childcare.
Yes.
Was it known that there were two vendors that, or some vendors that would take care of that issue?
It was a part of the implementation subcommittee that they worked with those vendors.
Okay.
Yes.
And the vote, was that a non-binding town vote? Is that what that was?
It was a vote of the school committee.
The school committee, okay.
There certainly have been members of our community who feel that it should be put to a vote
Okay,
of the
so
townspeople, but that,
It was the school committee vote.
the school committee voted in, I want to say December of 2015. They reversed the vote in March of 2016 to delay a year and had this implementation subcommittee. And then in March of this past year, they said they didn't have the money to do it. And so there hasn't been a vote to reverse it or cancel it. I mean, it's very sort of unclear where things are at with it.
Former town councilman in Middletown, I always piques my interest when someone says an ethical breach by the elected body. What did that mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, it was actually related to this commission. There was somebody who indicated that someone had misrepresented their position in our town in coming to speak to you all.
Okay. So the bottom line, from what I'm hearing you say, is in terms of, because my question was going to be your recommendations, because you have, obviously have a great background.
Thank you.
So you're basically saying that we should come up with a deadline, say, let's just say hypothetically in a year, let's just say hypothetically a year, where districts would look at it and say, for these reasons, we're not going to move forward with this.
Well,
Right.
or to say we can't do it by this deadline that you've
Okay.
set, but we have a plan in place for when we will be doing it.
Okay, and I'm talking to Tom from the Rhode Island Interscholastic League. Your idea about an athletic directors meeting, I think that would happen anyway. And talking to him, it's interesting to me because that is obviously one of the issues that comes up all the time. He doesn't think it's as big an issue as everyone else does.
It really, of the problems that were brought to our implementation committee's attention, that was one that was
Right.
pretty easily fixed,
Right,
actually.
and he would, believe me, if there was an issue, he would say it. So, no doubt about that. He's a great advocate for kids. Okay, thank you so much. Very
Thank
enlightening.
you.
Mr. Detoy?
Thank you, Ms. Rosengard, for your testimony. Since this is now the time for former town council people like I and Mr. Andrade, but I'm also a high school official and I referee 2 sports in the interscholastic league, and I can say, I think pretty unequivocally, that the officials would not have a problem having things start later, because it's easier to find officials at 4:30 than it is at 3 or 3:30.
Bet.
Particularly if there are games that you have to travel very far to. You mentioned that your school committee voted they didn't have the money. Was it specific to transportation, or what was the?
It was specific to transportation. I mean, it was frustrating because there was a coalition of the implementation committee who was actually able to present data to the school board indicating we wouldn't need additional buses for this. But the bus company told Mr. Masori that more buses would be needed, and that while there was no data presented to back that up,
Yeah.
that was what kind of won the day.
I raised that question because it came up, I guess, also in the testimony from East Greenwich a couple weeks ago. And having looked at this a lot while I was on the town council in North Kingstown, I couldn't figure out why you needed any extra buses. You're hauling the same
It's
kids.
the same number
you're
of
doing- yeah.
kids, right?
So I'm wondering if maybe, Madam Chair, if we haven't heard from the bus companies or some.
We haven't heard from them yet. We will be, but I think that there's a vested interest in their contract, so I think, don't know how much value they would add. There is a group that we're trying to get to from MIT who has set up algorithms to figure out how this can get done without needing extra buses.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I might want to be able to enlighten a little on that, too. Cindy Brown from RIDE is very involved with the statewide transportation system. As you know, we have a consultant that is housed at RIDE, Transpar, to do all the routes. I've talked to her about this. She would be happy to come in. I think she can help us out a lot in terms of the possible costs and answer questions about transportation.
Good, because I just want to reiterate, I know there was some discussion about the first bill that came out, and it was an underfunded mandate and has since been pulled, so we could establish this commission to figure out implementation at low or no cost to districts. So I think it would be really good if we had her at the next meeting, where we're going to roll up our sleeves and figure out implementation.
Okay.
Could I follow up on that? Was transportation the only issue that they talked about in the money, or were there other contributing factors?
At the time, it appeared that it was just that factor. We had sort of an unprecedented budget year last year where we got an approval to raise the cap of our tax increase because of our building a new middle school. And there was some contentiousness between the Committee on Appropriations and the school department around increases in the budget. And so it felt like it was not a year where it would be possible for that to be added into the budget as well. Although I understand that at this point, the school committee and administration is indicating that there were other issues. I don't know what they are.
Go ahead.
So the additional information that was provided regarding the additional costs, was that provided to the school committee prior to its initial vote, or was that provided after when the committee decided to delay implementation?
I know that when I started going to the forums very early on in the process, the issue of transportation came up, and the idea that we were going to need more buses came up. Some of it was that we were inadequate. We didn't have an adequate number of buses anyway. We were already picking kids up much too early. They were on the buses for much too long. And so a number of us who've been working on this initiative once they voted to delay for a year, we still wanted the transportation issue to be taken care of. And I think that's probably true in a lot of districts, that there aren't enough buses. And so that's another recommendation that the commission could make to districts, is to take care of the transportation issues and set goals, which our administration did do. They set a goal of no one's going to be picked up before 7 in the morning, and nobody will be on the bus for more than half an hour. And I think we've gotten pretty close to that. So tightening that up and finding efficiencies in the transportation system separate from start time is important.
I mean, I only asked the question because I would think that that would be the type of information that you want to have in the,
Sure.
and the school committee is doing its due diligence around
Right.
what any costs would be associated with the policy change. That's something that they would want to know prior to making the initial vote.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Walsh?
First, one of the issues that's come up with busing is that the parental bus does not run if the parents are already at work and you're having a later start time. It's as simple as how many parents aren't providing their own bus service for kids in the neighborhood versus taking the school bus, at least one of the things that we've seen. But thank you for coming to testify. My question, and one of the concerns I've heard that hasn't been addressed today, and you've got professional experience in this, to the extent that whether it's preschool daycare services or shift of activities that would have been after school to before school, how much advantage of more sleep are we losing by the kids getting up when they would have gotten up anyway and being delivered to the school when they would be delivered to the school anyway? Whether or not the official school day starts, we have all these kids who are going to be bleary-eyed and up because mom and dad get them up, or because whatever activity replaces it, or they just need to be there for daycare purposes.
My feeling about that is that that's then a choice of the individual family and parent versus requiring it of everybody across the board. So from a public health perspective, there may be people who choose to still stay on that early schedule, but then it's their personal choice versus something that they're required to do across the board. If I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, because there's a poverty factor to this
Sure.
too. People who can afford
Well-
other arrangements and people who can, and we don't want to feed another
Right.
problem accidentally.
The issue that we find is, I think because we have the early start time, lots of people do drive their kids to school. And even people who are in opposition to this in Barrington will drive their kids to school so that they can get extra sleep. I've always felt that if we actually shifted the
Well, they don't want to
school
fight with the
time-
kids in the morning, but I take your point.
I think that if we shifted the time, more people would ride the bus and wouldn't rely on their parents for getting a ride.
That becomes the transportation cost issue that people forget that,
Right.
you know, there is
Right,
an offsetting
Yep.
thing. But
yeah,
thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for your testimony. I really appreciate it. Just a couple of things that have come up in Cumberland, and we have been talking about this for a couple of years, and the biggest obstacle for us, not that there aren't a number of obstacles, which we all know exist, but certainly the cost is an issue. And just a couple of things related to some of the questions that have come up. Like, you know, from a logical perspective, you would think, okay, like we have 4 tiers. So we know that we're transporting literally thousands of students to our 8 schools every morning and taking them home every afternoon. And you would think that the schedule could somehow be arranged to accommodate a later school start time. Well, but it's not that easy, right? So it's a lot more complicated. We've actually had studies done. So we're in the fortunate position, and I think Barrington was in the same position where the school committee supported it. And, you know, and they started to get some pushback. One of the things that has come up is, you know, people seem to think that if you start school an hour later at the high school, for example, and if we started at 8:30, it would be an hour and 15 minutes later because we start at 7:15 in the morning, which makes me crazy. That if you start an hour later, it pushes everything back an hour. So sports start an hour later, students start their work an hour later, they do their studying for all their AP courses and all their courses an hour later. But the fact is, based on much of the testimony we've heard from doctors like yourself, that the research doesn't support that. There is no evidence to support that by pushing the time back an hour, that students get less sleep because they're staying up later and that sort of thing. They still go to bed the same time, they're just getting an hour more of sleep. And just 1 hour more has a significant benefit on their health in so many ways, not just their physical health, but also their mental health, which I'm sure you can appreciate in your field. So, no, thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
Superintendent Roger.
Comments Mr. Mitchell made, very similar in North Kingstown. We've been having this discussion for years before I was superintendent. A lengthy discussion happened on it in 2005. And the subject's been brought up a number of times. Mrs. Bento has been very vocal about it herself. And,
Phil, press the button up.
oh, sorry about that. Better? Thanks. So, so the issue that, you know, and someone brought up the issue, well, the buses take the kids the same number of routes anyway, why does it require more buses? And I'd like to just address that question, because that's the issue that we run into. I noticed someone in the testimony talked about this 4% rule for districts, that we have a cap of a 4% increase, which I consider a killer. It is the worst law for education that has ever come down the pike in the state of Rhode Island.
Amen.
There you go. We agree on something. So in North Kingstown, 4% is seen as something that is, you don't want to go there. Anyone who's elected wouldn't want to go to 4%. It's considered obscene to want to increase people's taxes by that much. However, in the years previous to this law being enacted, in North Kingstown, there were increases to the school department that were 6, 7, 8, and 9% in those years. And I was living in North Kingstown at that time. I don't remember people coming out with torches and pitchforks on the issue. I think it was ho-hum, 6%. We'll do that this year. School department needs it. And so there's something about that attitude that has changed. So this year, and every year, I have tried to draw the attention of our school committee to this issue. Some of the members of our school committee ran with this idea to improve the start times. And so the budget that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow night is one that, just to do next year, what I'm doing right now is a 6.5% proposition. That's it. No one's new, no new buses, no new anything. That's the reality that we live in. So in North Kingstown, with a 60 million plus budget, every percent is about $500,000. So to get to a 4%, which our elected officials have told us don't even think of going there, I already have to cut over $1 million. If I get on average what has been the allocation over the years since I've been superintendent, about 7 years, I probably have to cut about $2 million from the budget. There's no paper clips and pencils that come up to $2 million. It's bodies, it's needed staff, and I don't have any to cut. So to bring up the idea of adding buses. Now, over all these years, when we've been cutting back to get to those nice 2s and 1s and 0s in some years, the word from the school committee has been, well, we've only gotten this much from our town council. Can you do with one less bus? Okay, we'll make it work with one less bus. So now we have a school start time for high school at 7:15 in the morning. We have kids getting on that bus 6:30 and earlier. Our elementary, because it's 4 phases now, every bus does the same 4 runs. Our elementary start time is 9:35. Those kids are out of school around 4:30 in the afternoon. It is nuts. Nobody likes it. People have run for the school committee to do something different, and they can't do it because before we even have the conversation, we have to cut $1 million. And that's the good scenario this year. So, you know, So to get back to the point made about why do you need more buses, it just has to do with geography and time. North Kingstown is pretty long north to south. Its elementary schools are situated mostly in middle to the northern part of the town. So particularly if you live in the southern part of town, you got a long bus ride in. And you need time to accommodate that. Then you need time to get the next kids for the middle school. Then you need time to get the first tier of the elementary school. Then you need time to get the second tier of the elementary school. And if I had more buses, every one of those bus runs gets a little bit shorter. See what I mean? So you can tighten it up. And our, you know, after we've studied it year after year after year, our best guess is around $500,000. But that's not a one-time thing. We need it every year because that's the buses and the drivers and the monitors and everything comes with it. So, and you know, and that would get me from about 21 buses to about 28. And about 10 years ago, we had 28. But budget cuts meant you keep cutting back a bus every year to make it work. And yeah, about 80 grand a bus. And so it's just, so what I'm looking for, I agree 100% with you on the science, and it's the right thing to do. But what we need from this commission and from our state legislature is something about that 4% rule, and you know, something that's a sustainable funding mechanism to make that work, because it becomes something where you can't even start the conversation as much as you would like to. And people just get frustrated because you have to go through a lengthy study year after year, and it doesn't seem to move anything.
Thank you. Mr. DeTroy?
Superintendent Ogier, I probably voted for a couple of those budgets that
Back
you
in
talked about
2005,
back in the day. But I also remember having this conversation with the head of the school committee when my daughters were in kindergarten, because Colorado and several other places had already made this move. The studies had not been done yet, but looked positive and coming on. So that discussion has been going on a long time now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Oliveira?
So we addressed this approach this when I served as chair of the Providence School Board. Prior to my coming on the Providence School Board, the school district hadn't opened up its transportation contract for about 4 or 5 years. And so we approached it as a exercise of trying to get some efficiencies, try to find some savings, reopening up the competitive bidding on the contract. And so when we opened the transportation contract, one of our goals was to achieve just this, to have the high school start at a later date. And so you put together a tiered structure where the high school kids were being transported at a later start time than the earlier grades. And so we negotiated that as part of we put that in the bidding documents when we went out to bid for the transportation contract. And so when people responded to our bid, they built into their proposal these tiered structures, knowing we want the high school kids to start at a later time and what have you. We actually ended up achieving some savings in that. We saved about $1.2 million. And we did that because we did it as part of the contracting process. So it doesn't necessarily mean, if you want to do this, transportation does not have to be a barrier to it. Because you can, if a school district is so willing, and a superintendent and a school board are so willing, you can negotiate this as part of the bidding process, as part of the negotiating process of contracting a new transportation vendor. You just tell the people who want to apply for your bus contract, this is our structure. This is our tier structure. This is when we want the start times to be, and you propose a cost that achieves those goals. So I'm not so convinced that there has to be an additional transportation cost if you do it as part of the contracting process.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. The next witness is Andrea Vento.
Thank you. This commission's been meeting to discuss changing school start times, but I wanted to offer a few thoughts on an approach that the state could take. She just turned it on. Thank you. If you talk to a teenager and you ask them what time they get up to go to school in the morning, they'll often say something like, well, the bus picks me up at 6:15, so I have to be out the door at 6:10, so I set my alarm for 5:30 in the morning. So it's not just the school start time that is driving the teen wake time. It's also the school bus pickup times. In fact, you could almost argue that school bus pickup times are an even stronger driver of unhealthy teen wake times, because you do have to factor in the transit time on the school bus in addition to the school start time when a teen's figuring out what time to wake up. Granted, some students don't take the school bus, but I would bet that school bus routes are probably a pretty good proxy for how long it takes those students to get to school as well. And I know some have argued that the state shouldn't get involved with decisions regarding school start times, that those decisions need to be made at the local level. And that is the case today. The state does not have a role in school start times. But the state does, and can and does today, regulate school bus transportation. So maybe state legislators should be looking at those school bus pickup times and maybe thinking about setting reasonable hours for student transportation. People have talked about something like a dawn to dusk student transportation requirement, a requirement that would ensure that no student of any age is regularly boarding a school bus before dawn or being dropped off in the dark in the late afternoon hours. For example, a dawn to dusk requirement in Rhode Island, dawn occurs at its latest at about 7 a.m., a few minutes before 7 a.m., and dusk occurs at about 4:45 p.m. So a requirement, a dawn to dusk transportation requirement, would actually address the real driver of teen sleep deprivation, that early wake time to catch the school bus, but it's also just common sense for the safety of students of all ages. Really, no student of any age, whether they're in first grade or 10th grade, should be standing in the dark waiting to catch a school bus.
Andrea, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah.
I know I should know this, but I don't. What time is the first bus pickup in North Kingstown?
I think in North Kingstown it's about 6 a.m. In the earliest that I know of in the state is in Coventry, actually, and it's at 5:46 a.m.
Oh my God. Thank you.
That's about an hour before dawn at this time of year. And it's actually about an hour and a half earlier than the first buses start picking up in Newport. So we have quite a bit of variability or discrepancy among the school districts today in teen wake times. And some of that is driven by those long bus routes in districts like in North Kingstown and in Coventry. So the idea of a dawn to dusk student transportation requirement would require some change by some districts in the state, not all. But I think part of the factor here is that the ultimate decision about what to change, when to set school start times, would still reside with the local communities. So some districts may decide to shorten their bus routes but keep school start times unchanged, thereby getting those teenagers a little bit more sleep. Other districts may decide to keep the long bus runs but shift school start times, leaving a little bit more decision-making power in the hands of the local communities. I do support the state taking action as it relates to teen sleep deprivation, but I also have concerns about start times at the elementary and middle school levels. So I really encourage a thoughtful approach that takes into account the needs, the health, and the safety of students of all ages, and maybe looking at some guidelines around student transportation and setting reasonable hours for student transportation would be a way to do that. I don't have any answers about how to fund it, and I agree with Dr. Roger. It's been a challenge in our community, and I know in other communities as well, because I don't have any expertise in that area, but I really do urge the state to think very carefully about how they can support local districts to make the right decision for the students, and that's students of all ages. Thank you.
Any questions from Mrs. Vento? No? Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
And the last witness is Amy Schneider? Schneider. Okay.
So some of this is a bit repetitive because I'm not sure where you guys are at, so I apologize in advance. My name is Amy Schneider. I'm a physician at Women and Infants Hospital. I currently live in East Greenwich, and I am the mother of 2 teenage children. I began thinking about this topic years ago when my daughter was struggling with profound insomnia. I eventually began reading about sleep, the biology of sleep, adolescent changes. I fully expected to feel guilty again about shortcomings in my parenting technique, and was surprised to realize that this one was actually not my fault. So due to the changes in circadian cycles, teenagers are actually not able to fall asleep as early as they could as younger children, and yet they still need that 8 to 10 hours. As they grow older and advance through the stages of puberty, their natural tendency to sleep grows later and later. This phenomenon is attributed to 2 biological factors: the delayed release of melatonin, the pituitary hormone that promotes sleepiness, and second, the slower accumulation of sleep pressure in teenagers. A slower accumulation of sleep pressure makes falling asleep more difficult for older adolescents. Credible, peer-reviewed, and well-replicated studies have also found that adolescents have a longer internal day length. The intrinsic clock of an adolescent is greater than 24 hours, which may partially explain the shift of the circadian rhythm in adolescents. As a result of these shifting biological processes, teenagers show a predictable pattern and preference for staying up late at night and waking up later in the morning. So it turns out I am not a bad parent yet. There's time. Biology is full force against their sleep time. The only way to change this that I can figure out is to change the school start time. A later school start time, as you all know, has been endorsed by the CDC, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Medical Association, as well as numerous other organizations. Much of the scientific work originates from here in Rhode Island. Dr. Mary Karskadin and others in her lab have been responsible for groundbreaking findings regarding sleep in adolescents. In fact, many parents in town where I live remember taking part in her studies now 20 and 30 years ago. Some of the benefits for teens who get more sleep are improved academic performance, lower rates of depression, anxiety, less tardiness, fewer car accidents, higher standardized test scores. Adolescents who get less sleep are less likely to engage in risky behaviors, and they are also statistically more inclined to become obese as adults. One shocking study shows a 2-fold increase in serious suicidal ideation in teens who sleep less than 8 hours per night. Once I realized the problem, I really couldn't stop thinking about it and talking about it. After several years of forums in East Greenwich, debates, lectures from sleep experts, meetings with bus companies, surveys of teachers and students and parents, the school committee made the very bold move of moving the start time 30 minutes later. They were one of the first in the state to do so and demonstrated great leadership. This challenging change ultimately affects the entire school system. Complicated changes were required of the bus company, athletic schedules, parents, and caregivers. And the cost in the end was about $150,000 for added buses to change from a 3-tier to a 2-tier bus system. East Greenwich currently faces significant challenges to our school and town budget, so adding cost was not warmly welcomed by many. As we're currently only in our 2nd year of this initiative, it remains to be seen what the full benefits will be. I believe they made a scientifically sound decision that will bring tremendous health and academic benefits to many students at a cost that I believe is reasonable. No students that I've talked to want to revert back to the older start times. Many feel like they're benefiting from from more sleep. They face so many stressors these days as teenagers, and I believe we owe it to them to create a model which allows them to optimize their talents and strengths. Just to talk quickly about the transportation issue, which was by far the biggest sticking issue for us. We did a bunch of workarounds. We went from a 3-tier to a 2-tier, which was a lot of the added cost. We had a transportation committee that came up with a lot of small fixes that addressed some of the issues. One of them is making a wider walking circumference to school, so some of those kids were not riding the bus anymore. Not terribly popular, but safe and legal, so the police were careful to inspect the walks that that kids were expected to do. We also have an opt-out form for the high school students riding the bus. We noticed the high school buses are empty because most of those kids either have cars or do activities. So there'll sometimes be 6 or 7 children on a bus. So now they have an opt-out, so we don't have to provide a seat for every one of those high school children. While it remains a somewhat lively topic in our town, I think it has been accepted as overall improving, and I think that every town can come up with their own workarounds. I also think that in the end, $150,000 for a public health initiative, to me, seems worthwhile, a public health initiative that has true scientific evidence behind it. My other thought about sort of a statewide initiative would be if it's possible to somehow provide a one-time grant so that towns could possibly invest in their own bus fleet and then kind of dictate those runs as they see best for their student body.
Questions for Amy? I just want to add one thing, Amy. I think you're right. I don't think anyone here is disputing the science. I don't mean to speak for anybody, but I don't think anybody is disputing the science. I think we're just trying to figure out a way to implement this with the least amount of impact to the districts. And just for the record, everyone on this commission has a presentation that was done to the Biddeford School Board, and while it does spend a lot of time on the science, at the end there are popular options that could help us as a commission come up with some options or a plan for implementation.
Okay, great.
Do anybody else have any questions? Mr. Walsh.
I live in East Greenwich too, so I've seen the controversy firsthand. I'm just curious, Doctor, in your experience, just talking to fellow parents, and you're a strong advocate for your position, what's the feedback of your fellow parents been? It sounds like the students you talk to were gung-ho, keep things as they are. And from the teachers there, I hear mixed. I do hear the anecdotal, not scientific, anecdotal, a subset of the kids just confess they're staying up later. The kids don't mind staying up later because, you know, social media and whatnot, they get to talk to each other, often after the parents are asleep. But I'm just curious, the parents you talk to.
The parents that I've spoken to are mostly quite in favor of it. That being said, I know it was the athletic folks that were the most concerned. And as far as I know, that hasn't been a big issue. But I have not heard. I actually reached out today to talk to the athletic director to sort of verify that to be a bit more accurate. But I haven't heard that it's been a huge problem in terms of sports. And again, that whole, the sports thing, when you think about it, actually comes down to those last few weeks in the fall of football.
That's right.
That's really what it
when the
comes
sun
down
does, daylight savings time and all that.
When the daylight saving changes. So it's those last few weeks, and then really many of the teams have lights. So it seems to me you could sort of change the schedule to play all those end games at the teams that have lighted football fields. You know, so that was the huge pushback from the parents, was the sports schedules.
Thank you. If nothing else, you've got it on the record. You're a good parent. I heard it in testimony right here today.
Oh, no, it's not done yet. We'll see.
I have a question, and I don't know if anybody here has the answer. If you have the answer, maybe Mr. Walsh has the answer. But private high schools start later, but they figured out the sports piece of it. Like your Hendrickens, your LaSalle's, they've all figured it out. Why is it such a difference for public schools?
I never get the private high school questions. I don't, when they were all competing just with each other, it was easy. They were all on the same schedule, but obviously now they compete with our folks. What I don't know is what subset of preschool practices and activities they are. That was a question I asked earlier of our first witness, because you know, one of the things we learn, having been around for a long time, are the law of unintended consequences. And the last thing you want is, all right, kids, now that we have time in the morning, everybody show up early, and we're going to do, you know, now the extra section of band and athletic practice and club activities, and the sleep goes that way.
But to address that point too, though, a lot of those early drop-offs are the younger kids who are still falling asleep earlier, theoretically.
No, I'm talking about at the secondary level, that with more time in the morning, that kids come in early for preschool activities that substitute in. And we've seen that, and the superintendents here over the years might have seen it in their experience. Well, we don't have time, or half our kids in band in a small district are also in sports, so we're going to do the band practice before school. Oh, okay, so the kids are up early and carpooling in and everything.
It totally defeats the purpose. And then one other thought that just came to mind is perhaps the state could also look into restructuring instructional hours. I think that that's something that they do differently in Massachusetts, and that has been helpful in that exact example, so that band can now be, put in the middle of the day or the study hall or whatever the other things are that people need to do.
And I appreciate your frustration. I've been preaching for 25 years. We should get a common school calendar. Not school card time, common school calendar. Start on the same day, have the same holidays, have the same professional development days, have the same vacation, all these coordinated activities. And I'm told that never can happen. So I get your
That sounds like
frustration. Yes, that's another study commission probably.
Superintendent Auger?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to answer your question. I think my mic is on. Am I correct? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No problem. The question about the private school piece, I think it's an apples and oranges conversation when you're dealing with, say, Hendricken. Hendricken doesn't have a multi-tiered system because they
pay
on their own. If they need another bus, they'll raise the tuition to get another bus. But also, a lot of those students who go to Hendricken or LaSalle have a very lengthy bus ride already. In North Kingstown, there are maybe 1 or 2 communal stops. So a parent needs to drive halfway across town, get them to, say, a church parking lot where they pick up, and then head on up to Warwick. I can imagine there's probably an hour's all in, there and back. So it's a different ballgame altogether.
Thank you.
I don't want to speak for Tom Mezzanotte, but he and I have had many conversations about this issue. And just a couple of things that I recall from my conversations with him. Tom Mezzanotte was a high school principal before he became the executive director of the Interscholastic League. And I'm pretty sure that he was the principal of Classical High School for many years, and pretty sure he said that when he was principal, high schools in Providence, or most of them, started at 8:30 at that time. And it did not, and he's the executive director of the Interscholastic League. He is pretty comfortable stating publicly that he doesn't see where there's going to be that significant of an issue with scheduling, games and what have you. He also said that because things are very different now, where I don't want to suggest that there aren't teachers coaching athletics, but there are fewer teachers coaching athletics. So practice schedules aren't dictated by school schedules, like when school gets out. They're dictated more by the work schedule, in many cases, of the coach. So I think there's, and I think athletic directors are masterful in scheduling not only games but practices to accommodate the schedule of the coaches. But to me, I think that is starting an hour later is, I was an athlete. I was a college athlete. I wouldn't be here today were it not for my athletic experience. I would never do anything that would in any way prevent a student from being involved in athletics because it is so beneficial. I just think that getting an hour more sleep a night for adolescents far outweighs any of the minor inconveniences we may experience early on in making a move like this. It is, we say all the time, a bunch of us have been meeting regularly to talk about what can we do to make this happen, that, it's pretty clear that you can say that you don't want to do it, but you can't say it's the right thing to do, right? So, I feel like I have a responsibility as the superintendent to push for a later start time so that it has a healthy impact on our students.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. So we don't have our next date set up yet, but Kristen Dart will be in touch about our next date, and it looks like we're going to have to extend the length of the commission. But we'll all be in touch soon, so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Information.